Oh, very definitely the bush pilots today. All the Super Cubs you see around, they make more landings off runway than they do on runway. It's like anything else, you learn over the years, and the equipment's a little more sophisticated, and I think there's a lot of good bush pilots.
Some people are frightened of flying in small aircraft. A lot of people haven't ever flown on floats. That's something totally new for them. Also flying with a woman pilot is something totally new. Get 6 men in an airplane and I'm the pilot, and they look rather shocked when I walk out.
More safety items as far as the seat belts and harnesses, because they do wreck them a lot more than they do in lower 48. They land these things on the sides of mountains and river bars, and in the lower 48 they basically have good runways, and it's a lot safer.
Well, I look for some place long enough and smooth enough to land. Generally on the mountains, it tends to have a slope to it. It's usually a one-way type thing. You land going uphill and take off going the other way, no matter what the wind's doing.
Onboard computers have primary control of all the vehicle's critical functions. T-minus 15 seconds. 11, 10, 9, and we have a go for main engine start. 5, 4.
The space shuttle thunders off the launch pad, flying into space with hardly a notice from a jaded American public. On towards the new millennium it flies, the most complicated flying machine ever developed, carrying the hopes of humanity towards a common future. One of the shuttle's most recent missions has been to maintain the Hubble Space Telescope, enabling us to look into space and back in time billions of years to when our universe was in its infancy.
Two-engine Banjul. Roger, two-engine Banjul.
Jettison of the solid rocket.
But we need only look back 80 years to find the infancy of aviation. From the very beginning of aviation, the planes were used for transporting people and cargo. It was not long after the development of the airplane that there was one flying over Alaska's vast untamed land. People were fascinated by this new form of transportation. The takeoffs and landings were a spectacle not to be missed. Alaska and aviation was then, as space is today, a new frontier. You might say Alaska and aviation grew together. Reaching out to all corners of this giant land, the airplane and the pilots began replacing the dog team and musher as a way of transporting mail, people, and cargo from village to village. Early miners in their quest for gold took advantage of the new form of transportation. The miners could reach the precious metal in places that would have been impractical by dog or foot. Numbering only a few at first, most of the pilots were corn-fed Midwesterners. There are few history books that chronicle the names of these early aviators. An expression of the time, bush league, was used to describe them. It meant second class, second rate, or something from the farm or the sticks. But the people who knew them and flew with them thought the bush pilots were nothing less than heroes. They flew in airplanes so flimsy it was amazing that they stayed aloft. Combining the airplane with guts and determination, the bush pilot kept Alaska's aviation lifeline open. It wasn't long before the river bars and grass strips gave way to graveled runways and larger planes. Alaska's population was growing, and with it, the aviation industry. There continued to be demand for the small airplane in the less accessible towns and villages. The small planes could easily be adapted to the varied environmental and weather conditions. Skis were added to the planes when the ground was covered with snow. It was a lot of work keeping the airplanes operating in Alaska's seemingly endless winter. At 30 below zero, it took hours just to warm up the engines enough to start. Just because you were up and running did not mean you were out of the woods. Winter had its own lessons to teach these early aviators. Getting a few bangs and bruises along the way was part of it. Catching a wheel in a crack in the ice on a seemingly frozen lake was bad enough. Getting it out and flying again was a project in itself. In the spring, the ice thawed, giving way to the bush pilots' new runways, the thousands of rivers and lakes of Alaska. An airplane equipped with floats could take advantage of this. Once again, the pilots adapted the airplane to a new environment. A measure of the pilot's skill was his longevity. Is he a good pilot, someone would ask, and another pilot would respond, well, he's still alive, so he must be good. That was the way things were back then. The element of danger has always been associated as part of flying in Alaska bush country. This element of danger was like gasoline to fire, fueling the myth of the bush pilot. The intrepid nature of these individuals was becoming legend. Becoming a good bush pilot took luck, skill, determination, and good old American ingenuity. Most all of it learned by trial and error. Aviation was in its infancy. The early Alaskan bush pilots were redefining aviation. At the same time Alaska aviators were redefining the usage of the small airplane, there was another group of people doing some redefining of their own, the military. And with the military came the paved runways and metal planes. A lot of the original bush pilots turned in their bush flying wings for the new airline wings. Large multi-engine, multi-pilot metal planes were shrinking America even more. This marked the beginning of the end of the evolution of the small bush plane, an evolution that began with the Wright brothers and ended with the long paved runways of modern America. Most of the lower 48 states no longer needed bush pilots, and they began to go the way of the barnstormers before them, existing only in the stories passed on. Remarkably, Alaska bush pilots and their planes have persisted. Only in Alaska do pilots continue to redefine the limits of bush aviation. Today's aviator of Alaska has adapted the planes whose technology has changed little over the past 40 years. True wilderness. Alaska has an abundance of such wild places, and the mode of transportation most used to gain access to this wilderness is still the airplane. Today, as in the past, it is the wilderness of Alaska that draws people to it. Wilderness areas that support the fish and animals it is justly famous for. Alaska's gold of the new millennium is its wilderness area.
Steady now. Hold on. Here it comes. Closer in, yeah.
Alaska's wilderness and natural beauty fueled the small plane aviation industry of Alaska 75 years ago. It's the same wilderness and beauty that fuels the aviation industry today. During Alaska's summer tourist season, Lake Hood in Anchorage, by far the largest float plane base in the world, will have hundreds of takeoffs and landings a day. Most of the pilots in Alaska are private pilots. They're the pilots who use the small airplane as an RV, like you or I would use a boat or a motorhome. Most of these private pilots accumulate less than 50 hours a year flight time. There's no place in the world that has a concentration of small airplanes like Anchorage, Alaska. Lake Hood is the O'Hare Airport of the float plane world. Gwendolyn Ferreira, air taxi pilot operating from Lake Hood.
My grandfather came up in the early 30s, and he flew up here. My father flew here also, and so I was kind of raised in a flying family around airplanes, and currently the only female flying Part 135, which is the air taxis or air carriers off Lake Hood. They do what they call a 135 check, and the FAA goes out and flies with you, and so they check you out on every aircraft you're going to fly. 206 Beaver wheels floats, because they're two different configurations. I think anybody that flies in Alaska bush isn't really flying for money. It's got to be for pleasure, too. Anchorage, Alaska's got the largest float plane, privately owned float plane base in the world. So aviation's not an unusual thing here. A lot of people are into aviation and own airplanes. At Alaska Air Taxi, we have Beavers, 206s on floats and wheels, and we have used my Cub, and mainly because of the loads they can haul. They're just the ultimate bush plane, especially the Beaver.
With over a 40-year heritage of bush flying service, the Beaver, built by de Havilland Aircraft Company of Canada, is considered by most to be the world's best bush plane in its weight category. Originally designed as a float plane, the Beaver is one of the few planes specifically built for bush operation. The de Havilland Beaver isn't made anymore. The demands for such planes is very limited. With the last of them being made in the mid-60s, it's not unusual to fly in Beavers 30 years old. When was the last time you drove in a car that was over 30 years old?
For flying, I like to fly a lot of our rafters. I haul out a lot of people with all their gear and their rafts and everything, and they're all excited and looking forward to their trip, and you pick them up and they're exhilarated and they've had just a wonderful trip. Just being outdoors, they've enjoyed being away from the grind, and so I think I enjoyed that more actually than your everyday tour. Even though when you first start out you think, oh, it's another tour, you enjoy it once you're airborne and you start seeing it and you get all excited again and telling everybody about how wonderful the state is.
There can be upwards of 500 takeoffs and landings per day at Lake Hood. Gwendolyn may make 6 of them. On the average, a pilot flying for one of the air taxi services on Lake Hood may get between 500 and 800 hours per year flying time. Most all the air time is bush time.
I think a lot of the flying that's done in Alaska is bush flying. There are so many places that are unapproved. The strips are unapproved, landing in rivers, lakes. For bringing, tourism has grown a lot in Alaska, so there's a lot of people that go out fishing and hunting and sightseeing, and the places you land them are on unapproved areas. And it takes you a little bit of time to get real proficient in those aircraft. That's probably the most important thing, especially when you're flying them in out of rivers and tight places, and knowing what you can and can't get away with them. Probably the most enjoyable flying I like to do is mountain flying. It's extremely beautiful in the mountains, and when it's calm, the airplane's like an extension of yourself, and you just kind of float between mountains and valleys, and there's so much to see. It's just beautiful up there, and that's probably my most favorite flying there is in the mountains.
Gwendolyn is checked out to fly many types of aircraft. Her own plane, a Piper Super Cub, model number PA-18, originally built by Piper Aircraft Company, is older than she is. Its original design dates back to the early 40s.
The weather can be a real challenge, especially working in the fishery or even in the 135 operations, the tourism type operations. But there's certain things you just learn not to push, and if you're out flying in Prince William Sound, you learn to keep the coast always visible off one side of you, and if you ever turn, you get out over the water and turn back towards the land so you don't get yourself where you can't tell which is up and which is down.
Alaska is a land of stunning beauty that makes flying a rare pleasure. But with the pleasure comes the pain. Alaska weather is some of the most unpredictable weather on Earth. It's hard to believe that in this age of jet travel, the bush plane of choice is built with the aviation technology of 50 years ago. Alaska is one of the few places in the world that can support a small industry that does nothing but rebuild these airplanes. Dan Hollingsworth of Dan's Aircraft Repair.
The Cub flies so slow, and the gear is strong on it, the tail's built strong, and nobody's been able to match it really with a superior design. Some of them are fairly old. We get planes because they wear out. The bolts wear out, fabric wears out. They poke a lot of holes in them, just from running over sticks, fly up through the tail or inside the fuselages. A lot of them have problems with tubes rusting from the inside out. Also, we get a hold of them, we got to either stick a new fuselage in them or cut the tubes out that are bad and weld them back up.
Time takes its toll on these small airplanes. With the cost of a new airplane so prohibitive, the owners must have their old ones taken apart and rebuilt.
You can rebuild a Super Cub in 2.5 months, 2 guys, 8 to 10 hours a day, if you stay on it solid. This is not it's not assembly line, it's all hand work, and there's a lot of hand work. Each wing probably has over 1,000 screws in it.
With frames of steel tubing covered in fabric, these old planes seem to be stuck in a time warp. Originally designed in the early 40s as a trainer, the Piper Cub had a short military career during World War II and the Korean conflict. After the war, the Cub became popular as a low-cost utility aircraft. Today, the Cub is considered the finest bush plane in the world. Hand-built, their cost has skyrocketed.
They cost quite a lot of money to rebuild these things, and the average person who's not working the airplane can't afford it unless he's a doctor or a lawyer or has a good income. Just for an example, as far as this work being a lost art, we've had people call us from California, Oklahoma. They can't find nobody to cover their tail feathers or their fuselage. They call us up, ask us questions, or send us the part and we cover it. It is a lost art, and there's not that many people that really know how to do this.
As far as bush planes go, Mr. Piper had close to a perfect design with the Cub. There's a niche the airplane has filled, that of a bush plane. Without the passed-on skills of the craftsmen and pilots who work on them, the Cub would have long ago gone the way of the dodo bird, as did many other less successful aviation designs.
I wouldn't consider myself a bush pilot, but I do land on the mountains and on the river bars, and I'm probably just the average pilot. The guy that lands up on a glacier, on the side of the mountains, short 300-foot strips or shorter, that's what I would classify a bush pilot as. The guy that's, he can look at a spot and tell you what kind of terrain it is and if you can land there or if you can't land there, just by experience, by looking at terrain. Oh, there's still some bush pilots around.
When a bush pilot accumulates over 10,000 hours stick time, most all of it flying the backcountry of Alaska, he's at a skill level that could be characterized as an art form. Paul Claus is the quintessential example of a bush pilot. Flying since the age of 13, Paul is best known for the really remote and rugged type of bush flying.
You know, we have beaver to haul in people and supplies to the lodge, and Super Cubs we use for the real remote stuff, pioneering new places and exploring new places. My father wanted me to be an airline pilot originally and said that was the way to go. Lots of time off and travel and everything. But as far as flying, the type of flying we do here has to be the funnest in the world. It's never boring, you know, it's never the same. It's always something different. Even if you're going to a place that you've been before, the weather's different, the wind conditions are different. It's always different.
Paul flies a very basic airplane, one quite different from most small planes you see flying overhead. All instruments and gauges are non-electrical components. There are no lights on the plane, it has no batteries or wiring, and the radio he uses is charged up nightly and velcroed to the plane's instrument panel for the day. The airplane is controlled by a stick and rudder pedals connected to the wires that lead to the outside flying surfaces. The airframe and flying surfaces of the Super Cub have changed little over 40 years. However, large balloon tires, stronger landing gear, and disc brakes have been added, allowing for rough off-runway landings. Because there's no battery and there can be no starter motor for the engine, Paul must hand-prop the engine to start. By eliminating the electrical system, Paul has reduced the overall weight of the airplane by over 200 pounds. This enhances the plane's performance and allows him to do what he's best known for, mountain flying.
Flying, you know, you sit here at the lodge and it can, you know, might be really, really nice weather and you get up in the mountains and it might be different, or vice versa. You really don't ever know until you stick your nose in it. A lot of times picking up climbers and stuff on the mountains, you know, I might think that there's no chance, but I'll, you know, go up and take a peek at it, and a lot of times there's a hole there, there's openings that I can get up and get into the mountains.
What Paul is known for above all as a mountain pilot is his ability to land and take off the glaciers high in the mountains. He's unmatched at this unique form of flying. His background as a mountain climber, providing him the familiarity with mountainous terrain so necessary to this type of flying. Hours of flight time trial and error have put Paul in an aviation class of his own. Paul may have as much as 15,000 hours flying time as a bush pilot, most all of it in the mountains.
Well, glaciers are a real trick, landing on bare ice with wheels, because you don't have anything to judge the size of things that you're used to looking at, like trees or a building, or, you know, all you got's rocks and ice, and you know, a rock that's big enough to wreck your airplane might not look that big to you from what your eye sees. So judging how rough places are is the real skill. I've learned, you know, little tricks that different colors of ice that tend to be smoother. It seems like stuff that's got more dirt on it tends to melt out more evenly than just a pure white ice. A big percentage of places I land up high in the mountains it's one way, and you're gonna land that way, and you're gonna take off the other way. There's no other choice. It's too steep, and there's times when you go there and you can't land. The conditions aren't right. It's too much wind or whatever. So you have to be able to say no. I soloed when I was 14, and I had a private pilot's license when I was 17. But I've been riding around the back seat of a Super Cub with my dad since before I can remember, and really I learned everything, you know, basically from my dad. And I'm real fortunate to be able to continue to fly with him now. He's 60 years old and we still go out every day together, and our whole operation is family run, our lodge and whole entire business is family, and it's kind of a unique situation.
From the very beginning of Alaska's settlement, winter transportation relied on dogs and sleds. Winter supplies and mail to the remote villages and outposts was delivered by dog sled. By the end of 1924, airplanes had begun replacing the dog team in Alaska as the major form of backcountry transportation. The airplane and pilot was displacing the dog team and musher. With the advent of the snow machine, it seemed like the end of dog mushing as a means of winter transportation. However, today there's a resurgence of mushing as a wintertime activity, not only here in Alaska, but also in other parts of the country. The dog team and musher, along with the small airplane and pilots, are still here. They found their niche here in Alaska. Working together now more than ever, they provide the recreational and travel needs for people over the long winter. Today, there's a growing trend in Alaska aviation, eco-aviation, air taxi service based on tourism. More and more people come to Alaska to experience the natural beauty and recreation opportunities. Former Olympian downhill skier Max Moreau.
This is remote. At the end of the highway is remote by any standard, and we're 150 miles beyond the end of the highway. So this is way out. This is a remote area. Without this airplane system here that these people have, this would be inaccessible to 99.9% of all the people.
Spring skiing on the Wrangell St. Elias mountain range is to the skier what the North Shore of Hawaii is to the surfer, or the Himalayas to the mountain climber. In the Wrangell Mountains, you get to name the runs you make and ski peaks that have never been skied. The only way you can get to these magnificent mountains is by plane or dog team. You could walk, but the snow would probably be melted before you got there.
You have the team of the Klaus father and son, Paul and John, and they have the Beaver type aircraft, which we see over here in the forefront, and then they ferry you into a base camp, an area where you begin to ski at whatever level you're going to do for that day. With the Beaver, it carries about 8 or 10 people, and then they bring in Super Cubs, very high-powered, small aircraft that can land and take off in a very short distance. And with the skills of these pilots, they can take off in a low land, circle around to elevation, and they land on spaces that you think is impossible. And they do it very comfortably, and you know, they're adequate at their work, and you feel very safe and confident. And the uphill can be just about as nice as the downhill.
Most of today's remote lodges and bush pilots got their start as guiding services for the hunters and fishermen who came to Alaska. The ever-growing ecotourism industry of today is more and more becoming the staple for the lodge owners and the air taxi services. Many of today's visitors are looking for the unspoiled natural beauty of Alaska and will go to great lengths to experience it. They prefer skiing the mountains rather than mining them. Paul spends his day flying skiers to the top of the mountains so that they can ski down, all day making trip after trip to the top of the mountain.
And the mountains here, the St. Elias Mountains, are, well, it's the highest range in North America. And they go up to 20,000 feet. Mount Logan, which is in Canada actually, is 20,100 and some feet. And then Mount St. Elias and the surrounding mountains go from 20,000 feet down, and we're 1,000 feet above sea level here. So, you know, it's just dramatic.
dogs go on to meet with John Claus, Paul's father, at the Beaver for their plane ride back to the lodge. In the early days of bush flying, a common practice among pilots was to make flyby supply drops. With bags of flour and an outhouse as a target, this bombing tradition is kept alive as a competition at the Gulkana Air Show. Every spring, people come from all over Alaska to this air show dedicated to bush pilots and their planes. They come to see the latest in bush aviation development and design. All types of planes and pilots get involved with the air show. The air show climaxes with the STOL competition. STOL, meaning short takeoff and landing, is the ability of a pilot and his plane to take off and land in the shortest possible distance. Rooted in bush flying tradition, today it's used to help define what bush flying is. A pilot's ability to land and take off in a short distance meant added territory that he could service. There are some pilots who take this idea of short landing and takeoff to the extreme. Weight conscious, they put on miniature tail wheels, and for added lift, they install vortex generators to the leading edge of the extended wings. This highly modified plane is suited well for this type of competition, but is not practical for landing on the side of a mountain or on a glacier.
Coming in and landing is Dave King from Gulkana.
Unfairly, STOL is often used as the ultimate measurement of a bush pilot's skills. Although important, STOL plays a small part in the overall development of a skilled bush pilot.
Put on vortex generators.
Notice how the pilot works the tail of this highly modified plane to help coax it off the ground. These extreme measures pay off with a 30-foot takeoff, and once airborne, can fly very slow. Regardless of how your plane flies, when you land it, you must land on the mark, or as close to it as possible, and stop in the shortest possible distance for the highest score. Once airborne, it almost seems like these airplanes do not want to land. A lot of these planes are working bush planes, the same planes their owners fly to make themselves a living. A regular of the show is master bush pilot Bill Ellis. His plane is a slightly modified Super Cub. Here he shows how it's done. The extreme crossroad is needed to overcome the forces of prop and engine torque. Another Alaska bush pilot, Arthur Wickel, comes in for a landing, drops his plane in on the mark, jams his brakes, and makes one of the shortest landings of the day. Ultima Thule Lodge, Wrangell St. Elias National Park. Located 120 miles from the nearest road. Everything, including the tractor John Claus uses to maintain the lodge, had to be flown here. John Claus has been flying Alaska backcountry for over 30 years. John talks about what it takes to become a successful bush pilot.
Well, there are no real big secrets. It just takes experience. And basically, we're landing on places, whether it's ice or gravel bars or tundra, that you've never been before, and you don't know just what the conditions are. And it takes some time to learn that. And if you've walked over it and can judge from the air what the land looks like, whether it's ice or tundra or gravel, the size of the rocks, that's hard to learn from just flying over. And you have to try it a time or two. And so many times, at first, you misjudge it. The rocks were really a lot larger than you thought. The ditch was a little deeper than you thought, and the muskeg was a little softer than you thought. But the next time you'll have a little better idea, and then the next time even a better idea. And it's not something somebody can tell you about or you can read in a book. You have to learn it on your own. There are a certain number of cardinal things that you just cannot make a mistake. And one of the first things you learn when you're doing any kind of mountain flying or bush flying is if you want to look at something in a valley, you never start from the bottom of the valley and work your way up. You do just the opposite. You circle up around, keep plenty of elevation, start at the top of the valley, and then go down the valley. And, we've seen that. We could, right from where we're sitting here, I can look at a valley where a person lost their life. It was a very low-time pilot, and he did just the opposite. And once the airplane won't climb as fast as the valley is climbing, you're going to run into the ground. And what generally happens is people become aware that they're not going to be able to climb out of that, so then they make a turn, and many times that turn is fatal because the airplane just spins in then. If the valley's not too terribly steep and you just keep going right straight ahead, you stand a real good chance of surviving it.
Paul, John's son, is the embodiment of what he has described as a bush pilot. Paul is a bush pilot in the truest sense of the word. John explains why his son Paul has evolved into the pilot he has.
He has, in my opinion, an uncanny ability to judge the countryside, just exactly what we were talking about, especially on glaciers. Many times there'll be a color variation, maybe some rocks and then white and then some more rocks. And as you fly over that, it could just look absolutely impossible. The rocks give the impression of a ditch or something, but he spent so much time doing it and actually walking over the country that he's developed an ability to judge just how smooth it is. And he really doesn't make many mistakes anymore doing that.
After several passes down the glacier, Paul thinks he's found a place long enough and smooth enough to land. By setting the flaps, Paul slows the plane down and generates more lift in the wings. He will make his approach as slow as the plane will fly. At 10,000 feet, landing on a glacier on the side of a mountain, the plane's landing speed will depend on wind conditions on the glacier. A landing that is, in most cases, one way. Once committed, there's no turning back. Many of the irregularities of the ice that would have meant a disastrous landing to planes of 30 years ago can now be absorbed by the large balloon tires. The low air pressure of the tires allows for off-runway landings on very rough terrain that would have been unthinkable to land on with the early planes and smaller tires.
And it's not uncommon to literally land with full power, and you literally let the glacier or the slope fly into you.
picking up climbers on a glacier, transporting dogs to the top of a mountain, or acting as a ski lift for skiers. These are just some of the chores of the Alaska bush pilot today. There's no other place in the world that a pilot can make a living flying people and supplies into the wilderness as they can do in Alaska. To make a living at flying these small planes is like no other occupation. The average income of most of these pilots is probably less than $50,000 a year. That is, of course, if there are no mishaps that would result in major expenses or rebuilds. What draws men and women to pursue the adventure and occupation of bush flying? Is it the allure of flight or the land they fly over? Ultimately, it's Alaska and its wilderness that draws men and women to it. For the pilots who live here, the wilderness represents freedom. Freedom to fly wherever their hearts say they must.
Yeah, and it's a lifestyle that we've got here, and like I say, it's family run, and it's kind of like a ranch. You know, we don't most everything we make gets thrown back into the business and into the airplanes and into the lodge itself, and don't really get rich, but we have a very rewarding life, and we get each day flying around. I never get bored, never get tired of it. I can't think of anything that I'd rather do.
The reason I'm working on these airplanes and build them is because I like to fly them myself. That's what got me involved with this. As far as I'm concerned, that these airplanes are the best bush airplanes in the world. And Mr. Piper had close to a perfect design as far as a bush plane. And people keep trying to build airplanes to beat them, and they haven't been able to do it.
Every time I'm out there flying, I feel like that it's something that you just don't feel doing anything else. I've often told my family if I die in an airplane, then they'll at least know I died doing something that I love.
On August 27, 1994, Gwendolyn Ferreira and her boyfriend, Jeffrey Gustafson, died in a plane crash in the Talkeetna Mountains of Alaska during severe turbulence.
Without this airplane system here that these people have, this would be inaccessible to 99.9% of all the people.
You know, all the Super Cubs you see around, they make more landings off runway than they do on runway. It's like anything else, you learn over the years, and I think there's a lot of good bush pilots around.
It may be that the men and women who take off for the adventure of flying over the wilds of Alaska are trying to live the myth of the bush pilots of long ago. Or could it be that they, the true bush pilots of Alaska, are a living myth, living the adventures that will be passed on as stories told to the young and old who can only dream of flying over the wilds of Alaska?